we're at a great historical turning point. The population of the rich countries will fall by about, the working age population will fall by about 20% in the course of the century. Yoram Hazony was talking about the birth dearth and its impact, but it's the most important economic event in the long term. It's the most important economic event in the long term. Shortage of young workers. The population of the so-called middle-income countries, that's mainly global south, countries where people earn anywhere from $2,000 to $15,000 a year of per capita GDP, will continue increasing. In the case of Taiwan and South Korea, which have the lowest birth rates in the world, the working age population of the century will fall by 75%. They'll effectively disappear. That, by the way, is why I don't think China will invade Taiwan. The Chinese typically don't fight for what they can take over without a fight in the fullness of time. And as things stand, Taiwan will effectively disappear as an economic effect for demographic reasons. The competition among empires of the past was competition for territory and natural resources. The great competition today is for people. That is, for workers who could be trained to do functions in a modern economy. Places like Indonesia, with its 320 million people, or Brazil, with more than 300 million people, become important. China had a plan to march through the global south, just like Mao Zedong in the Civil War, to surround the cities from the countryside and dominate these economies. The plan was called the Belt and Road Initiative. It was a thorough plan. It started with dominating key infrastructure, including digital technology. Huawei is, in a certain way, the world's most important company. Huawei and its sister ZTE now ship most of the telecom equipment in the world, and probably 3/4 in the global south. 10 years ago, I heard a Huawei pitch to the government of Mexico, sat in on it. And they had dissected the Mexican economy, telecom sector. They knew it backwards and forwards. They told the Mexicans just what they ought to do and how Huawei could gear them up for the modern era. And I asked the Huawei people, gee, that was a pretty thorough presentation. Did you do that just for this meeting? They said, no, go on our website. We've got a plan for 100 countries. They did, and they're executing it. Now, China has terrible problems. But there are two things that China really has gotten right. One is their dominance of the global south. Since COVID, China has doubled its exports to the global south, tripled them to Central Asia, and triple them to Russia. This includes everyone from Brazil, Mexico, Indonesia, and India, democracies to autocracies. Chinese don't seem to be curious about how barbarians govern themselves. They want to dominate the key infrastructure, digital and physical, which hooks these countries into supply chains that China controls. Now, of course, we impose tariffs on Chinese imports. And we acted very much like, if you remember the old Disney movie Fantasia, Mickey Mouse as the Sorcerer's Apprentice. We had a broom that was enchanted and inundated us with imports, so we took an axe and we smashed the broom. And what happened in the movie, of course, is each piece of the broom turned into a new broom and inundated us. Under Biden, our trade deficit in goods has gone up by 50%. It's now $1.2 trillion a year, as opposed to $800 billion under Trump. Most of that increase has come from the developing world, from Vietnam, Mexico, India, places that Janet Yellen, our genius secretary, calls friend shoring. In fact, most of the imports we're getting for the developing world are de facto re-exports from China. China builds factories, sells components, assembles stuff, and they sell it to us to get around the tariffs, and that's as true of India as of Mexico. So we're more dependent, thanks to Biden, on Chinese supply chains than we ever have been before. But it's not simply re-exports to the United States. A great deal of this is building infrastructure and building plants around the world. We're worried about Chinese EV imports prospectively. Well, BYD, the biggest Chinese electrical vehicle maker, is building plants in Turkey, in Mexico, in Brazil, in Thailand, and Hungary. Janet Yellen tells the Chinese, oh, please, you've got too much capacity. Could you try to restrain your exports? The Chinese say, fine, we will become the domestic industries of the developing world. Now, China has a demographic problem. They've got an aging population. There are two things you can do about that. One is you can open the floodgates to immigrants. You know, we're trying that, and how's that working out for us or for the Europeans? The other thing you could do is export your technology to countries and employ their labor at home. That's the Chinese approach. Even though China is losing workforce, its skilled workforce is exploding. Last year, they graduated 10.5 million college students. That's twice the number we did, but a third of those are engineers. So China's graduating 6 times the number of engineers that we are. In fact, more engineers than the whole rest of the world combined. Now, think of South Korea, which quintupled its industrial production between 1990 and 2010, even though its workforce shrank by 20%. They did that by doing entirely different things than they did before. They built autos, they built ships, they built semiconductors, and the South Koreans became a major industrial power. China's economic program is simply to repeat the South Korean experience, but on 10 times the scale. Now, you hear a lot about, China being about to collapse. China does have a debt problem. Their debt is about 270% of GDP. Ours is 265% of GDP. It's roughly similar. The difference is we are borrowing $1 trillion a year from the rest of the world, and China is lending $1 trillion to the rest of the world. Countries with gigantic current account surpluses don't have financial collapses. They have reorganization. So the idea that we can sit around and wait for China to collapse demographically or financially is, in my view, the most dangerous form of self-delusion we could engage in. So that's one thing China did right. Locking large parts of the global south into their supply chains. The second thing they did right was to use their artificial intelligence capabilities for manufacturing industry and logistics. That's why BYD can produce a $9,000 EV and still make a profit. It's like Henry Ford in 1908 with the Model T. This is the Model T, if you will, of the 21st century, which the median income family in the third world is able to buy. But what they can do for EVs, they can do for a lot of things. I saw a Chinese plant last summer operated by Huawei, which had 50 workers and produces 2,400 5G base stations a day. They come off the line like hotcakes. It's almost entirely automated. The Chinese can do the same thing for cruise missiles. They've got a plant that produces 1,000 cruise missile motors a day. Now, cruise missiles are an older technology, but if you can produce hundreds of them per day, remember that an American destroyer can carry physically 100 interceptors. So China's application of AI to manufacturing gives it enormous capabilities in firepower. It's as big a difference between musketry and bows and arrows. And that makes the American military position in an expeditionary force in the Western Pacific kind of problematic. It's fine to talk about prioritizing Asia, but with what? We would need new kinds of weapons based on new physical principles to defeat this. So what would we have to do? What's happening to our industry? Our industrial production under Biden is lower than it was under Trump, according to the Federal Reserve's index. Orders for capital equipment are down in real terms by about 20% since Trump left office. We're still losing ground under Biden, and it would probably take, to restore our position, my guess is an additional incremental $1 trillion in purchases of capital equipment, and the training of about 2 million industrial workers. Now, considering we spent $6 trillion in subsidies after COVID, $1 trillion shouldn't be hard to find, but we haven't been finding it. So if you look at our relative position to China, we spent, what, $6.5 trillion on forever wars, and we ended up with very little to show for it. China spent $1 trillion in subsidies for infrastructure, and China has a great deal to show for it. China has, to my knowledge, 200 combat soldiers deployed outside China. They're Marines sitting in Djibouti for anti-piracy. We have 230,000 soldiers deployed overseas. China's long march through the infrastructure and supply chains of the global South has been more effective than what we've done. And I hate it when that happens. So the biggest problem we have is that we are now so dependent on imports for capital goods that the majority of the goods that make goods that we produce are imported. And a great deal of that depends on Chinese supply chains. So if we want to invest more so we're less dependent on imports, we first have to import more to get the capital goods to produce the goods we need to reduce our dependency in the future. That's how bad it's been under Biden. That, by the way, is why I don't think an across-the-board tariff is the most effective thing we can do, because it'll raise the cost of capital investment. I'm for selective tariffs on key industries that we need to protect, including auto. So just as a footnote, we can discuss that more in the question period. Now, we haven't done very well playing whack-a-mole with China's technology industry. We've denied them certain kinds of access to advanced chips, but they found a way of working around most of that. From China's standpoint, for the industrial applications, the factory automation, which is the core of their program, the chips they can make at home work well enough. They probably take them, 20 years, if ever, to match what NVIDIA could do. But that doesn't slow down their grand scheme. So how do we break through this? I think we need a moonshot approach, a strategic defense initiative approach. We have to go all in. Incremental measures are not going to cut it anymore. When you go back to the Kennedy era, in 1965, at the peak of the Apollo program, 1 out of every $8 spent by the federal government was spent on research and development. It's now 1 out of 50. That's the kind of national effort we made when we went all in. That kind of approach under the late Carter administration and Reagan, we invented the digital age to win the Cold War. Every single technology of the digital age came out of America's effort to beat the Soviet Union in the Cold War. I don't think that shifting around a reasonable amount of the defense budget from Ukraine to Asia is really going to cut it at this point. That would be my disagreement with Bridge Colby. We need a dramatic Reagan or Kennedy-style approach to break through and let America's superiority in innovation leapfrog the Chinese. Otherwise, we're going to be number 2. And I hate it when that happens. Thank you very much.